The old alarm clock rattled at 4:30 a.m., its sound echoing through Sarah Mitchell's small wooden house on the outskirts of Birmingham. She didn't need it, though. Her body was already awake, trained by 20 years of early morning routines. The springs of her bed creaked as she sat up, her feet finding their way to the cold wooden floor in the dark. Sarah was 45 years old, but she moved with the energy of someone much younger. She walked to her window and pulled back the worn cotton curtains, looking out at the still dark street. The streetlight on the corner flickered, as it always did, casting dancing shadows on the cracked sidewalk below. In her tiny bathroom, Sarah went through her morning routine with careful precision. She washed her face with cold water and patted it dry with a clean towel. Her hands, rough from years of cleaning other people's homes, moved automatically as she pinned her gray streaked hair neatly against her head. 20 years of domestic work had taught her that appearance mattered. White employers wanted their help to look presentable. Opening her closet, Sarah pulled out one of her 5 work dresses. It was made of simple cotton, faded blue with tiny white dots, but clean and pressed. She had ironed it the night before, just like she did every evening. The dress might have been old, but there wasn't a wrinkle to be found on it. Sarah believed in dignity, even in a job where others tried to strip it away. As she made her bed, Sarah's eyes drifted to the loose floorboard under her bedroom window. Nobody who visited her modest home would guess that beneath that board lay a small notebook filled with carefully written notes, names, dates, conversations she had overheard while cleaning houses in the wealthy part of town, information that could change everything. In her kitchen, Sarah lit the gas stove and put on a small pot of coffee. While it brewed, she packed her lunch: 2 pieces of bread with a thin spread of butter, an apple, and a small jar of water. She couldn't afford much more, but she never complained. Her simple lunch was wrapped in a clean cloth and tucked into her worn leather bag, right next to a second notebook, empty, waiting to be filled with whatever she might learn today. The coffee was hot and black, no sugar or cream. Sarah stood at her small kitchen window, sipping it slowly, watching as the sky began to lighten. Her neighbors' houses were still dark. Most of them wouldn't wake for another 2 hours, but Sarah knew the importance of being early. Early meant she could walk to work through Kelly Ingram Park without drawing attention. Early meant she could hear the police officers talking among themselves as they changed shifts. Early meant information. Before leaving, Sarah checked her appearance one last time in the mirror near her front door. The woman who looked back at her seemed ordinary enough: an aging black domestic worker in a clean but worn dress, sensible shoes, and a simple bag. Perfect, because that's exactly what Sarah needed them to see: just another maid, invisible, unimportant, not worth a second glance. What they didn't see was the sharp mind behind her careful eyes, the detailed memories she stored away, or the network of people who relied on the information she gathered. They didn't see how she could remember conversations word for word, or how she could map out police patrol patterns in her head. They didn't know that some of the most important civil rights attorneys in the South waited for her careful notes, passed through a network so secret that even her closest neighbors didn't suspect. Sarah locked her front door and stepped out into the cool morning air. The street was quiet except for the distant rumble of early delivery trucks. She began her walk, her shoes making soft sounds on the sidewalk. To anyone watching, she was just another black woman heading to work in the white part of town, just another maid starting her day. But Sarah Mitchell was anything but just another anything, and soon the same police officers who barely glanced at her as she walked past them would learn this lesson the hard way. Though right now, on this cool spring morning in 1963, she was simply walking to work, counting her steps, watching, listening, and remembering everything. The morning sun was getting stronger as Sarah walked through Kelly Ingram Park. It was just past 6 o'clock a.m., and the park was mostly empty except for a few birds picking at crumbs on the ground. She had walked this path hundreds of times before, but something felt different today. The air seemed heavier, filled with tension. 3 police officers stood near the park's central fountain. Sarah recognized them immediately: Officer James Burke, known for his quick temper; Officer Michael Wilson, who always had a toothpick in his mouth; and Officer Thomas Reed, the youngest of the 3, who usually followed whatever the others did. She had written about them many times in her hidden notebooks. Sarah kept her eyes down and her steps steady, just like she always did, but today, Officer Burke's voice cut through the morning quiet. "Hey you, stop right there." His boots made heavy sounds on the pavement as he walked toward her. She stopped, keeping her face calm even though her heart was beating faster. Her worn leather bag felt heavy against her side, filled with her lunch and her empty notebook, and something else they couldn't know about. Sarah had seen too many others make the mistake of running or arguing. She knew better. "Yes, sir?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on a spot just below his chin. 20 years of working in white homes had taught her exactly how to look respectful without looking directly at them. Officer Wilson walked over, the toothpick moving from one side of his mouth to the other. "We got reports of someone matching your description passing out illegal papers," he said, spitting out the words along with tiny pieces of wood from his toothpick, stirring up trouble among the coloreds. Sarah's mind worked quickly behind her careful mask of submission. She knew exactly who had been passing out flyers. Young college students who worked with the movement. But they had finished their work 2 days ago, and none of them looked anything like her. These officers were fishing for trouble. "I'm just heading to work, sir," she said softly. "Mrs. Harrison is expecting me to have her breakfast ready by 7. She mentioned the name on purpose. Mrs. Harrison was the mayor's sister, and everyone knew it. Officer Reed, the young one, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe we should let her go, Burke, if she's working for the Harrisons." But Burke wasn't listening. He grabbed Sarah's bag, pulling it roughly from her shoulder. "We'll see about that." He dumped everything onto the ground, her wrapped lunch, her water jar, her notebook. The cloth holding her lunch came undone, sending her bread into the dirt. Sarah watched her food fall, keeping her face still even as anger burned in her chest. She thought about the other notebook, the real one, safely hidden under her floorboards at home. These men could take her lunch, but they couldn't take her real work. "What's this?" Wilson grabbed the empty notebook, flipping through its blank pages with dirty fingers. "Planning to write down some more trouble?" "It's for Mrs. Harrison's grocery lists, sir," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "She likes me to write down what she needs from the store." Burke stepped closer, his face just inches from hers. She could smell coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "You think you're clever, don't you? Acting all proper and innocent. We know what your kind is up to." Sarah stayed silent. She had documented men like him for years, their habits, their patterns, their weaknesses. She knew Burke was the type who got angrier when people talked back. So she said nothing, which made him even more frustrated. "Check her pockets," Burke ordered Reed. The young officer hesitated but stepped forward. His hands shook slightly as he patted Sarah's dress pockets. She stood perfectly still, her dignity wrapped around her like armor. "Nothing," Reed reported, stepping back quickly. But Burke wasn't satisfied. His face had turned red with anger and frustration. Sarah saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. She had seen that look before, had written about it in her notebooks many times. It was the look that came before violence. "Well then," Burke said, his voice low and mean, "maybe we need to make an example. Show everyone what happens to troublemakers." He grabbed Sarah's arm roughly. "Wilson, see that tree over there? I think it's time we taught someone a lesson." Sarah didn't resist as they dragged her toward the old oak tree. Her mind was already working, remembering every detail, every word, every action. Someday, she knew, these men would regret this morning. But for now, she had to survive it. The old oak tree stood tall and dark against the morning sky, its thick branches stretched out like giant arms, casting long shadows across the grass of Kelly Ingram Park. Sarah felt the rough bark against her back as Officer Burke pushed her against the tree trunk. Her arms hurt where the officers gripped them, but she kept her face calm. Behind a nearby building, someone moved in the shadows. Sarah caught a quick glimpse of Jimmy Carter, a young photographer from the black newspaper. She had seen his camera flash reflect off a window. Sarah knew Jimmy well. He was part of her network, always ready with his camera to capture proof of police brutality. But she couldn't look his way. She couldn't risk the officers noticing him. "Get the rope from the car," Burke ordered Officer Reed. The young officer ran to their police car, his footsteps heavy on the morning grass. Sarah noticed his hands were shaking when he returned with a thick piece of rope. Officer Wilson laughed, still chewing on his toothpick. "Maybe this'll teach these troublemakers to stay in their place." He grabbed one end of the rope and started making a loop. Sarah felt her heart beating hard in her chest, but years of gathering information had taught her how to stay calm on the outside. She watched Wilson's hands work with the rope, memorizing every detail. She would need to write all of this down later, the type of rope, the way they tied it, every word they said. "Lift her up," Burke commanded. Wilson and Reed grabbed Sarah's arms, raising them above her head. The movement made her dress sleeve tear slightly. Burke took the rope and wrapped it around her wrists, tying them to a low branch that stretched out over their heads. Sarah's feet could barely touch the ground. The position made her shoulders burn with pain, but she didn't make a sound. Instead, she focused on the details around her. The way Burke's badge number caught the morning light, the smell of Wilson's cigarette smoke, the nervous sweat on Reed's forehead. From her painful position, Sarah could see more people gathering at the edges of the park. Some hurried past, looking away. Others stopped to watch, their faces showing fear and anger. She saw Mrs. Johnson, who worked at the corner store, cover her mouth in shock. Mr. Peterson, the old man who swept the sidewalks, stood frozen with his broom in his hands. Behind the building, Jimmy's camera kept clicking softly. Sarah silently thanked God for his presence. These pictures would tell the story that needed to be told. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Burke taunted, walking around the tree. "Think you can go around causing trouble in our town?" He stopped in front of her, his face red with anger and something else. Enjoyment. Sarah had seen that look before in other officers she had documented. Some of them enjoyed causing pain. The morning sun grew hotter. Sweat ran down Sarah's back, making her torn dress stick to her skin. Her arms felt like they were on fire, but still, she didn't speak. Her silence seemed to make Burke even angrier. "Say something," he shouted, his face close to hers. His spit hit her cheek, but she couldn't wipe it away. She just looked straight ahead, her eyes focused on something far away. Officer Reed shifted uncomfortably. "Burke, maybe that's enough. Someone's gonna see." "That's the point, kid." Wilson cut in, finally spitting out his toothpick. "Let them see. Let them all see what happens when they step out of line." More people had gathered now. Sarah could hear whispers, could feel their eyes on her. She knew some of them were part of her network. They would spread the word about what happened here. They would tell the civil rights lawyers. They would remember. The sun climbed higher in the sky, marking an hour since they had first stopped her. Sarah's arms had gone numb. Sweat dripped into her eyes, but she blinked it away. She thought about her notebook at home, hidden under the floorboard. After this, she would have so much to write, not just about what these officers did, but about how their actions proved everything the movement had been fighting against. Through the pain and humiliation, a small part of Sarah felt something like satisfaction. These men thought they were teaching her a lesson. They didn't realize they were just giving her more evidence, more proof of their cruelty. Every minute she hung, there was another nail in their coffin, another piece of testimony that would eventually help bring change. Behind the building, Jimmy's camera clicked one more time, while Sarah hung from the oak tree in Kelly Ingram Park. Her real treasure lay hidden in her small house. Under loose floorboards, behind fake walls, and inside hollow books, she had built a library of secrets that could shake the entire Birmingham Police Department to its core. That evening, after the officers finally let her down and she had recovered enough strength, Sarah sat in her dimly lit kitchen. Her shoulders still ached badly, and her wrists showed angry red marks from the rope. But her hands remained steady as she wrote down everything that had happened that morning, not missing a single detail. Mrs. Johnson from the corner store had brought her some ice wrapped in a clean cloth. "You should rest, Sarah," she said softly, watching her friend write in the notebook. But Sarah just shook her head and kept writing. She had been doing this work for too long to stop now. After Mrs. Johnson left, Sarah walked to her bedroom. Her movements were stiff and painful, but she had work to do. She knelt down slowly and lifted the loose floorboard under her window. The space beneath was deeper than anyone would guess, and filled with carefully organized papers. Sarah reached down and pulled out 5 thick folders. Each one had a police officer's name written on it in her neat handwriting. She opened Officer Burke's folder and added today's notes to the already thick pile of papers. This wasn't the first time Burke had hurt someone in the park. Sarah had been collecting stories about him for 3 years. Next to her bed stood an old dresser. Sarah pulled out the bottom drawer completely and reached into the hidden space behind it. Here she kept photographs, hundreds of them, taken by Jimmy and other brave photographers. Pictures of police brutality, secret meetings of white supremacists, and evidence of corruption. She would add Jimmy's new pictures from today once he got them developed. The hollow space under her kitchen sink held another secret: detailed maps of Birmingham showing police patrol routes, locations of civil rights meetings, and safe houses where activists could hide. Sarah had drawn these maps herself, marking them with special symbols that only movement members could understand. In her living room, Sarah kept her most important documents inside her old family Bible. Between its pages were letters from civil rights lawyers, testimonies from victims of police violence, and lists of witnesses who were willing to speak up. The Bible was the perfect hiding place. Even if police searched her house, they would never think to look through a black woman's Bible. Moving carefully because of her injuries, Sarah gathered all the new information about today's incident. She wrote down every word the officers had said, described the rope they used, and noted how many witnesses had been in the park. She even drew a small map showing exactly where everyone had stood. Around midnight, there was a soft knock at her back door. Sarah opened it to find Jimmy, the young photographer, holding a large envelope. "I got them developed right away," he whispered, stepping inside. "These are the clearest ones yet, Miss Sarah." They spread the photographs on her kitchen table. Jimmy had captured everything: Burke's angry face, Wilson's smirk, young Reed's uncertain expression. Most importantly, he had clear shots of Sarah tied to the tree, her face calm despite the violence being done to her. "These will help the lawyers," Sarah said quietly, sorting through the pictures. "But we need to be careful. Make 3 copies of each. Send one set to Reverend Johnson's church in Atlanta, one to the lawyers in New York, and one to our friends at the newspaper in Chicago." Jimmy watched her work with admiration. Even after being hurt and humiliated, she was focused on the bigger picture. "Miss Sarah," he said softly, "how do you stay so strong?" Sarah looked up from the photographs, her tired face showing a small smile. "Because every piece of paper in this house is a brick," she said. "And one day, we're going to build something with these bricks, something that will help our people find justice." After Jimmy left, Sarah carefully hid the new photographs and notes with her other files. Her body was tired and sore, but her mind was sharp. Burke and his fellow officers thought they had taught her a lesson today. They didn't realize that they had just added more evidence to a case that had been building for years. In the quiet of her house, surrounded by her hidden files and secret documents, Sarah finally allowed herself to rest. Tomorrow would bring more work, more watching, more collecting of evidence. But for now, she had done her part to move the struggle forward, one painful, important piece at a time. 3 days after the tree incident, Sarah's tiny kitchen came alive at midnight. 5 people sat around her small table, speaking in whispers. These weren't ordinary visitors. They were key members of what Sarah called her kitchen cabinet, the secret network she had built over 20 years. Reverend Marcus Thomas, who everyone thought was just a quiet preacher, spread out a map on the table. Mary Louise Baker, who worked as a telephone operator, wrote messages collected from overheard police calls. David Wilson, a janitor at City Hall, carried papers he had rescued from office trash cans. Professor Angela Wright from the Colored College brought student reports about police movements. And Jimmy Carter, the young photographer, shared his latest pictures. "The tree incident has stirred things up," Reverend Thomas whispered, his finger tracing lines on the map. "White folks are talking. Some don't like what the police did to Sarah." Sarah poured coffee into chipped cups, moving slower than usual because of her still sore shoulders. "That's exactly what we needed," she said quietly. "When they hung me there, they thought they were showing their power. Instead, they showed their cruelty." Mary Louise leaned forward, her voice low. "I heard something interesting on the police lines today. Officer Burke's wife called the station, upset about people leaving notes in their mailbox. Seems like some white ladies from her church are asking questions about what her husband did." Sarah nodded, making notes in her special notebook. She had learned long ago that white people's guilt could be a powerful weapon for change. "What about City Hall, David?" The janitor pulled some crumpled papers from his pocket. "They're worried. The mayor got 3 calls from newspaper reporters up north. They're asking about police behavior in Birmingham. Found these papers in the trash after their emergency meeting." Professor Wright adjusted her glasses. "My students counted 8 new police patrols in the colored neighborhoods this week. They're nervous, trying to show force. But it's making more people angry, especially after what they did to you, Sarah." Jimmy spread his photographs on the table. These pictures are traveling fast, he said proudly. Chicago Defender wants to run them next week, and SCP lawyers in New York are asking for copies. Sarah looked at her kitchen cabinet. 5 ordinary people who helped run one of the most effective intelligence networks in the civil rights movement. None of them looked special. That was their strength. Who would suspect a maid, a preacher, a janitor, a telephone operator, and a teacher of running such an operation? Remember how this started? Sarah asked, touching the worn tablecloth. 20 years ago, right here in this kitchen. Just me writing down things I heard while cleaning white folks' houses. The others nodded. They had all joined one by one over the years, each bringing their own way of gathering information. Mary Louise could listen to police radio without anyone noticing. David collected thrown-away papers that told important secrets. Professor Wright's students could watch police movements while just walking to school. Reverend Thomas heard things in his church that even the police didn't know. Next week is important, Sarah said, opening her notebook. Burke and his friends think they scared us, but we're going to use what they did to make changes. She started giving out assignments, her voice firm but quiet. Mary Louise would listen extra carefully to police calls. David would watch for special meetings at City Hall. Professor Wright's students would map out where police cars parked at night. Reverend Thomas would talk to his friends at other churches, sharing Sarah's story. Jimmy would get his pictures to more newspapers. Remember, Sarah told them, we're not just collecting information. We're building a case. Every note, every picture, every piece of paper is evidence. When the lawyers are ready, we'll show that what happened to me wasn't just one bad day. It's how they treat our people all the time. As her kitchen cabinet gathered their things to leave, Sarah watched them with pride. To the outside world, they were just regular folks trying to get by. But here, in her kitchen at midnight, they were soldiers in a different kind of army, fighting with information instead of weapons. Be careful, she told each one as they left through her back door, disappearing into the dark Birmingham night. Keep your eyes open. Keep your heads down. And remember, they never suspect the quiet ones. After they left, Sarah added new notes to her hidden files. Tomorrow, she would go back to cleaning houses, looking harmless and invisible. But now, after the tree incident, her network was stronger than ever. The police thought they had hung up a helpless maid. They didn't know they had actually helped the leader of Birmingham's most powerful secret resistance. 1 week after Sarah was hung from the tree, Birmingham woke up to a storm. Not a storm of rain and thunder, but a storm of pictures and news that shook the city to its core. The Chicago Defender's front page showed Jimmy's photographs in stark black and white. There was Sarah, hanging from the oak tree, her face calm and dignified. There was Officer Burke, his face twisted with anger. There was Officer Wilson smirking, and young Officer Reed looking scared. The newspaper's headline read, Alabama Police Torture Respected Maid. Sarah sat at her kitchen table that morning, drinking her coffee and reading the paper that Professor Wright had brought her. Her shoulders still ached when she lifted her cup, but she felt a different kind of strength today. The truth was finally coming out. The telephone in Mrs. Harrison's house, where Sarah still worked, rang all morning. White ladies from the garden club called, shocked to see their friend's maid in the newspaper. Mrs. Harrison herself couldn't stop crying when Sarah arrived for work. Sarah, why didn't you tell me? Mrs. Harrison asked, holding the newspaper with shaking hands. I've known these officers for years. I never thought they would. Her voice trailed off as she looked at the pictures again. Sarah just kept quietly dusting the furniture. Some things are hard to talk about, Mrs. Harrison, she said softly, but inside, she was thinking about the notebook hidden under her floorboards, filled with stories about those same officers that would shock Mrs. Harrison even more. By afternoon, more newspapers had picked up the story. The New York Times ran a special article about police brutality in the South. The Atlanta Journal wrote about how Sarah had worked for the same family for 20 years without a single complaint. Every story showed Jimmy's photographs. At the police station, things were falling apart. Officer Burke arrived to find his locker covered with copies of the newspaper pictures. The police chief called him into his office, yelling so loud that Mary Louise could hear it through the telephone switchboard. Even Officer Wilson's toothpick couldn't hide his nervous frown. Reverend Thomas reported that white churches were talking about it during their Wednesday meetings. David, cleaning the halls of City Hall, heard the mayor shouting about bad publicity and damage control. Professor Wright's students noticed fewer police cars patrolling their neighborhoods. The biggest surprise came when 3 more maids who worked in wealthy homes came forward. They had stories about Officer Burke too, stories about threats, about rough treatment, about fear. Sarah had their stories already written down in her notebooks, but now they were ready to speak publicly. Jimmy's phone at the black newspaper office rang all day. Big newspapers from New York, Chicago, and Washington wanted to buy more of his pictures. But he told them what Sarah had taught him: share the truth, but keep some evidence back. They still had more photographs they hadn't released yet. That evening, Sarah's kitchen cabinet met again. The mood was different this time, excited but careful. They knew this was just the beginning. The NAACP lawyers called, Professor Wright announced. They want to use these pictures in a bigger case. They're collecting evidence of police brutality across the South. Mary Louise shared what she had heard through the telephone lines. Burke's been suspended. Wilson too. Reed quit the force this morning. Sarah listened to her team's reports, making notes in her special notebook. Everything was moving faster than they had planned, but she had been preparing for this moment for 20 years. Her files were ready. Tomorrow, more pictures will come out, Jimmy said proudly. I saved the worst ones for the second day. That's what you taught me, Miss Sarah. Always keep something in reserve. Late that night, after everyone left, Sarah stood in her bedroom looking at the old oak tree through her window. It was just a dark shape against the sky now, but it had become something more. Those few hours she spent hanging from its branches had opened a door that couldn't be closed. She touched her sore shoulders gently, remembering the rope. Officer Burke and his friends had tried to make an example of her that morning. They had succeeded, but not in the way they planned. Instead of scaring people into silence, they had created a moment that would help break that silence forever. Sarah smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring more photographs, more stories, more truth. The quiet resistance she had built through years of patient work was finally finding its voice, and that voice was getting louder every day. 2 weeks after the photographs hit the newspapers, Sarah sat in a quiet office in downtown Atlanta. The room was filled with 3 civil rights lawyers, 2 NAACP officials, and stacks of her secret files that she had carefully transported from Birmingham. Attorney Michael Roberts, a tall man with glasses and graying hair, spread out 20 years' worth of Sarah's notes on the long table. His hands shook slightly as he touched the papers. Miss Mitchell, he said, his voice full of respect, do you realize what you've given us here? Sarah sat straight in her chair, her work dress as neat as always. 20 years of watching, she answered simply. 20 years of writing down everything I saw and heard. The youngest lawyer, James Turner, was reading through Sarah's detailed notes about Officer Burke. These incidents go back 15 years, he said, amazed. You've recorded dates, times, witnesses, everything we need. The third lawyer, Patricia Washington, one of the few black female attorneys in the South, smiled at Sarah. When they hung you from that tree, they had no idea they were attacking the most dangerous woman in Birmingham. Sarah's evidence filled 32 boxes. Each one contained carefully organized proof of police brutality, corruption, and civil rights violations. There were Jimmy's photographs, Mary Louise's notes from police radio calls, David's rescue papers from City Hall trash cans, and hundreds of witness statements Sarah had collected over the years. We're not just going to sue those 3 officers, Attorney Roberts explained, holding up one of Sarah's notebooks. We're going to sue the entire Birmingham Police Department. Your evidence shows this wasn't just a few bad officers. It was a whole system of abuse. The NAACP officials took notes as the lawyers explained their plan. They would use Sarah's tree incident as the starting point, but her massive collection of evidence would show a pattern going back 20 years. But we need you to testify, Attorney Washington said gently. Are you ready for that? It will be dangerous. Sarah thought about her kitchen cabinet back in Birmingham, still gathering information every day. She thought about Mrs. Harrison, who had surprised everyone by offering to testify about how good a worker Sarah had been. She thought about the 3 other maids who had come forward with their stories. I've been ready for 20 years, Sarah answered. That's why I wrote everything down. I knew someday someone would need to tell the truth in court. The lawyers worked late into the night, building their case from Sarah's careful notes. They found patterns they hadn't known existed. Sarah's files showed how certain officers always worked together, how they picked their targets, how they covered up their actions. "Look at this," James Turner said, holding up one of Sarah's maps. She marked every place they hurt someone. It shows they were targeting civil rights meeting spots on purpose. A week later, the lawyers filed their lawsuit in federal court. The papers were 3 inches thick. The main evidence was Jimmy's photographs of Sarah hanging from the tree, but behind those pictures were 20 years of Sarah's quiet work. The Birmingham Police Department tried to fight back. They said Sarah was lying, but she had dates, times, and witnesses for everything. They said she was just a troublemaker. But dozens of white families she had worked for came forward to defend her character. They said she was working with outside agitators, but her evidence showed she had built her network entirely within Birmingham. Officer Burke was the first to break. Faced with Sarah's detailed records of his actions, he agreed to testify against other officers. Officer Wilson followed soon after. Young Officer Reed had already quit the force and offered to tell everything he knew. The police chief tried to save himself by blaming his officers, but Sarah's files showed how he had covered up their actions for years. David brought more papers from City Hall showing how the mayor had known about everything. One evening, as Sarah left the courthouse after testifying, Attorney Washington walked with her to her car. "You know what makes your evidence so powerful?" the lawyer asked. "It's not just the big things, it's all the small details you wrote down. The time of day, the weather, what people were wearing, what they said. You made it impossible for them to deny anything." Sarah looked up at the courthouse steps where she had just spent hours telling her story. "I knew that someday, someone would need to know the truth," she said quietly. "And the truth is in the details." The trial would go on for months, but Sarah had waited 20 years to tell her story. She could wait a little longer for justice. Each day in court, she sat straight and proud, watching as her careful notes and quiet dedication brought down the system that had tried to break her. 40 years after Sarah Mitchell was hung from that oak tree in Kelly Ingram Park, a small museum opened in downtown Birmingham. Inside the main room, behind clean glass, sat Sarah's notebooks, photographs, and files, weapons she had used to fight for justice without ever raising her voice. Sarah herself, now 85 years old, sat in a comfortable chair near the museum entrance. Her hair had turned completely white, and her hands showed the age spots of time, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. Young people came from all over to hear her story. Miss Sarah, a college student, asked, holding one of her old notebooks carefully with gloved hands, "Weren't you scared when they hung you from that tree?" Sarah smiled gently. "Fear is a luxury that busy people can't afford," she answered. "I was too focused on remembering every detail to be scared. Those officers thought they were punishing me, but they were really just giving me more evidence." The museum told the whole story, how Sarah's lawsuit had led to the firing of 38 police officers, how the police chief and mayor had both resigned in shame, how her careful notes had helped change police training across the South. The old photographs showed everything: Sarah hanging from the tree, the court cases, the changes that followed. Her kitchen cabinet had its own special display: Mary Louise's telephone operator headset, David's janitor's keys, Professor Wright's student reports, Reverend Thomas's church records, and Jimmy's camera, all laid out to show how ordinary people had worked together to fight injustice. "The real heroes," Sarah often told visitors, "are the ones nobody suspects. The maids who listen while they clean, the janitors who find truth in the trash, the quiet ones who keep their eyes open and their mouths shut until the right moment." Jimmy Carter, now a famous photographer with gray hair, still came to visit Sarah every week. "Remember that morning in the park?" he would ask, looking at his old pictures on the museum wall. "That was the day that changed everything." "No," Sarah would correct him gently. "That was just the day they finally saw what we had been doing all along. The real change happened slowly, one notebook page at a time, over 20 years. The old oak tree still stood in Kelly Ingram Park. The city had put up a small bronze plaque telling Sarah's story, but more importantly, the tree had become a gathering place. People came there to remember, to learn, and to tell their own stories. Sarah's methods had spread far beyond Birmingham. Police reform groups studied her careful note-taking system. Civil rights organizations taught her patient gathering of evidence. Young activists learned from her story that sometimes the quietest resistance is the strongest. The museum's most popular display was Sarah's cleaning uniform, the simple cotton dress she had worn that morning at the tree. Next to it hung the rope the officers had used. But Sarah had insisted they add something else. Her hidden notebook from that day, showing her careful writing about everything that had happened. My grandmother was one of the maids who came forward after your story came out, a young woman told Sarah one day at the museum. She said you taught her that education isn't just about school, it's about paying attention and keeping records. Sarah's legacy lived on in other ways too. The Birmingham Police Department now required all officers to take special training about her case. Law students studied the lawsuit that her evidence had made possible. History classes taught about how one quiet maid had helped change the system. In her old age, Sarah still kept a notebook by her chair. Old habits, she would say with a smile, but people noticed that she still wrote down everything she saw and heard. She still kept track of which officers patrolled which streets. She still collected stories from people who faced injustice. Why do you still take notes? A young reporter asked her once. Haven't things changed enough? Sarah looked at him with those sharp eyes that had seen so much. Things have changed, she agreed, but change needs watching too. Freedom isn't something you win once and keep forever. It's something you have to guard, every day, with open eyes and careful notes. On quiet evenings, Sarah would sometimes visit the old oak tree. She would touch its rough bark and remember that morning 40 years ago. The tree had grown taller and stronger, its branches reaching higher into the sky, just like the movement she had helped build, growing slowly, quietly, but reaching always toward justice. They hung the wrong woman that day, she would tell the young people who gathered around her at the museum. They thought they were punishing a maid, but they were really attacking a historian, a detective, and a freedom fighter. They never knew who I really was, and that was their biggest mistake.